of the conference is communication policy and strategy. So whenever we talk about communication, whenever we discuss communication, actually communication should be understood as the final stage of fostering those who are involved in communication. That's and we also have to think about the instrument, the tool which is used in communication, that is language. Generally speaking, we have to think about the competence of those who are involved in communication, therefore language users' competence. And this is what I'm gonna present in my lecture, talking about language and culture. As you know, language, this is somehow directed, my discussion is directed towards linguistic competence, while culture, well, I'm just telling you in advance, it's gonna be just a few words on culture, and I'll try to explain the notion of culture, etc. Especially that the title is the language and culture interconnection, and this relationship, this connection, especially the relationship, is clearly demonstrated in the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is often criticized. Anyway, if we analyze it in detail, if we look at it from some different perspective, we can see how helpful it can be, well, just discussing this problem, the language-culture interconnection. So let me somehow now pass to the discussion, and I've got to say that in the course of the discussion, I'm just using some quotations from the literature, and I tried to put the stress, well, nomen, as I said, on the interconnection between language and culture, and language and culture viewed as a key components determining successful language usage, in this case in communication, and also successful language studies, since I mentioned, you know, that most of us, as I understand, are involved in teaching foreign languages to students. Finally, I tried somehow to put my attention on the role of creativity and expressiveness. If communication, you are successful if you are expressive. So, and coming back to what I started with, namely with competence, well, I tried to develop an image, a view known just or presented to you as creative communicative competence. So, well, just this is in brief what can be found in my presentation. And now let me come to the very text of it. Well, so let us start with language and culture at work. Well, we know that the modern world, especially now on the brink of the 21st century, is governed and guided by human communication. So people representing different nations, different professions, organize fora, panels, or conferences like this one in order to negotiate, well, different issues. And for such debates, the conditio sine qua non is the adoption of internationally recognized means of communication. Well, as we know, in the civilized world of the Middle Ages, the role of international language was played by Latin. Nowadays, the same role has been assigned to English, and this is the evidence anyway. Whenever we talk about any international means of communication, this is the evidence that at any stage of human development and activity, there has always been a need for communication, and therefore the employment of commonly accepted linguistic instrument responsible for inevitable human contacts. So let us think, what is responsible for the effective use of language? To use language effectively, it is inevitable first to construct and then to employ the whole system, which is responsible for expressiveness of the language user. And this is just one of those main issues I'm gonna discuss later on. So I use the term system, which automatically indicates that there must be more than one element as a component part. So just I somehow disclosed at the very beginning that it's one of those elements must be language. Now, apart from the language in its traditional means or perception as a means of communication, so there must be one more element of the system. And it is quite reasonable that, as you may expect, this element must be culture, and especially the language users' cultural competence, which combined with linguistic competence is responsible for expressiveness and for success in communication. So this sketchy account can be presented graphically. Of course, so I'm not going to draw anything on the wall or whatever. Anyway, if we can imagine a triangle, so I try to build graphically the a sort of the communication triangle, where its three legs are grammar, culture, expressiveness. So this is what the communication triangle is supposed to be. Well, at first glance, if you can imagine it, the components parts of the communication triangle may seem arguable unless they are made plain and thus comprehensive. So, well, in the course of my presentation, I tried somehow to explain what they stand for and what is what roles they play. Well, grammar. Grammar, in this case, is understood traditionally as the branch of linguistics which deals with syntax and morphology, and in consequence is a system of rules which make language work. Hence, grammar is viewed as the study of how words and their component parts combine to form sentences and finally make the language expressive, or actually the language user expressive. Instead, well, anyway, grammar as an element of the discussed here triangle, we may frankly say, stands for language, only denoting its core element. So whenever reference to grammar is given, it denotes language in its panoramic image, which comprises, according to von Humboldt's terminology, language as a process, energeia, and language as a product, ergon. Nevertheless, it is necessary to underscore that language has to be viewed as a system of graphic, signs, and vocalic signals, which are used in the course of communication to pass on information, exchange views, or demonstrate moods and feelings. So the language signs, signals, or symbols are utilized in the process of communication and become a conventional code acquired and known to language users who represent a given language community and are distinguished from another community by rituals, social norms, manners, or behavior. In this way, language symbolizes cultural reality. This is cultural reality and testifies to the identity of those individuals who compose a culturally distinguished community. This standpoint is also supported by Gramsci, who says, and here comes a quote, "Language is not culture-free code distinct from the way people think and behave, but rather it plays a major role in the perpetuation of culture." So, even a rough analysis of the above quoted opinion makes us realize that the idea of linguistic determinism, as once presented by Benjamin Wolfe, is quite realistic. That's why, I decided somehow to return to that the original version and present it in a somewhat different way. Now, we must not forget that communities may differ with reference to the way of thinking and the mental characteristics of a given group of people in general. Generally speaking, we differ. And well, actually, it was a lengthy discussion in the morning during the presentation of the Professor M from Spain. And well, there was something. He was talking about some different issues, but actually, some linguistic or cultural differences are really important whenever we talk about European Union as a unity. Unity in diversity, as some people say. Anyway, so, well, in this respect, as you can see, the somewhat controversial and criticized Sapir-Whorf hypothesis gains momentum. The Sapir, well, we know that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, as we actually know it today, can be broken into basic principles: linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity. And later on, I'm just going to show how these issues work within the triangle. So, anyway, it is linguistic determinism which puts a stress on the interconnection and interrelationship between language as a code and culture as its background. The hypothesis refers to the beliefs that the language we use to some extent determines the way in which we view and think about the world around us. The concept emphasizes the relationship between language and thinking as an immanent act of mind, characteristic of people representing a social group. Nevertheless, it can be concluded that language actually determines thought. And that was the issue which somehow caught my attention. Well, a controversial issue. Anyway, in this respect, it, as I said, it gives a momentum to be presented in a somewhat different way. Now, well, that's, I would say, enough as far as that part of language is concerned. So let us concentrate on culture. Culture, on the other hand, requires a more detailed description, and it refers to a much wider scope of human activity and knowledge. And in this way, defining culture is a specific task, because among scholars there is no unanimity concerning the notion of this phenomenon, which is commonly identified with civilization. Culture, civilization, well, that's the simplest, let's say, presentation. Anyway, scholars often rely, and here comes a quote, they rely on a generic concept of culture as a collective name for language, religion, art, law, state, history, society, craft, etc. See, everything. It has to be underscored that the phenomenon of culture is multi-component and multi-constituent, and thus requires a panoramic view, which in turn results in numerous standpoints and thus definitions. Quite recently, culture also began to attract the attention of linguists, ethnographers, and foreign language educators who perceive the significance of implementation of cultural material into the foreign language curriculum. And that was the point I mentioned at the very beginning. What comes out of such observations is the prevailing opinion pointing to the language user's cultural experience as the key factor which makes one's linguistic competence complete. So, competence, what kind of competence? Linguistic, not enough. So linguistic plus cultural, we may say that in a sense, well, the language user's competence may be considered as complete. Well, from this view in turn comes out the notion of culture as, and another quote from Levine, culture as an inherited system of ideas that structure the subjective experience of individuals. End of quote. It means that culture has much to do with the shaping of individuals' identity. And again, it could be referenced to the Spaniard's presentation. So unity and diversity, which in many cases is a decisive factor responsible for quality of human contacts and thus communication. So the quoted by me, the author, Levine, underscores a substantial integrity of culture and communication. The same point of view is also represented by many scholars who rightly say that communication and culture are acquired simultaneously, and therefore they cannot exist separately. Hence, this opinion results in working out one more definition of culture. So, as I said, many definitions, many standpoints, according to which, and this is a quote, culture is a shared consensual way of life, and that sharing and consensus are made possible only through communication. See, again. More and more convincing and thus common becomes the opinion that it is impossible to acquire a new language completely and manifest its mastery without acquiring knowledge of social norms and cultural beliefs and values of the speakers of the language in question. Why? Because, and another quote, meaning is embedded in cultural conceptions of context, and that, accordingly, the process of acquiring language is embedded in the process of acquiring culture. Voila. Again, strong integrity and interconnection between language and culture can be found in Karen Rasinger's point of view, a Danish scholar. And she says that, quote, human culture always includes language, and human language cannot be thought without culture. Linguistic practice is always embedded in and in interaction with some cultural, meaningful context. End of quote. Following the aforequoted thoughts, opinions, or whatever, we come to a very adequate definition by Eleanor Ox, whose observation on culture may be considered as the quintessence of the ongoing here discussion, my presentation. According to her, now, what she says is a quote, culture is a system of implicit and explicit ideas that underlines and gives meaning to behaviors in society. These ideas are related in various ways, to various extents, according to school or paradigm, to political, economic, religious, and kinship relations, events, interactions, and institutions, to values, to conceptions of the world, to theories of knowledge, and to procedures for understanding and interpreting. See? Now, without regard to drawbacks of any definition, as none of them may be perfect, a characteristic to be considered while discussing the phenomenon of culture is its social aspect. Since language is also a social construct, so language and culture interconnectedness must be a natural process, and the only instant of questioning and analysis is either the very process itself, again following von Humboldt's terminology, the process, energeia, or its output, ergon, created within a given period of time and at a given layer of human activity, such as, for example, political, economic, religious, interactional, education, just to mention a few. Although briefly presented, it seems, however, that the images of language and culture have been, I guess, adequately illustrated while building the image of the communication triangle. That's why, I wanted somehow to describe, explain, and define those component parts just to make us understand what I mean by those communication triangles. So now, the third and the final element of the triangle, that is expressiveness, has to be determined. The term expressiveness, as used for the purpose of my presentation and working out the idea of triangle, is understood as vivid, effective communication in speech or writing. It is also an explicit and comprehensive presentation of human mind's product, often full of emotions and feelings. So, expressiveness manifests the power of mind. Moreover, expressiveness, as mentioned earlier, has to be considered as the output resulting from the language-culture interconnection and interrelatedness. We can imagine that the procedure of interrelatedness, which involves and activates language and culture, is a sort of clash between these two components of the communication triangle. This sort of clash results in the final product, which appears in the form of language demonstrated by its user who represents a given cultural community. So, it's quite natural that this community, like any other community, can be recognized by its political, economic, religious, educational, or behavioral views, beliefs or matters in general. Undoubtedly, views, beliefs, conceptions of the world, or theories of knowledge are prerequisites for the understanding and interpreting of the language in use. Moreover, they become essential to carry on a discourse and comply with the principles, both linguistic and cultural. Hence, it can be concluded that a high level of expressiveness testifies to the quality of communication in speech or writing, and therefore to the style and elegance of language. Evidently, expressiveness is the result of interconnection between language and culture. As a matter of fact, expressiveness is directly related to the presence and linguistic activity of a human being, the individual who simultaneously uses language and represents culture. Therefore, the language user, due to his linguistic performance, becomes the main linking element, joining the legs of the communication triangle. In consequence, the notion of the communication triangle emerges as a three-leg construct composed of tool, background, effect. Tool, well, grammar, well, language generally speaking. Background, culture. Effect, expressiveness. So, each of the three component parts are marked by the human presence, and each of them is made workable by a human being. From a variety of contemporary approaches to language and culture, one general conclusion may be drawn, namely, the unity of social life of a given social community is maintained by the community language, since language is regarded as a social product and communication device functioning within this community. So, well, I remember my discussion, for example, with Professor Bill Labov, whom I had the pleasure to meet years ago at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And he says he considers language to be, and I remember, and I use this term, considers language as a social institution. So, moreover, language, from what we have already learned, appears to be a manifestation of culture, as all kinds of social activity are generalized by language. This is so because communication is inevitable in all cultures, and it involves all participants or consumers of culture, regardless of their social status or age. So when we know, well, it's a sort of truism, but language does not develop in isolation, but the development of man is simultaneously the development of language and culture. Here, it is apparent that the process of language development, especially a foreign language, so that's again my reference to students and academics, should be viewed as, regarded as actually intercultural education. So you can hardly consider the language user's knowledge as complete without achieving the fullest possible competence, including cultural. And this is the opinion which I find support to this opinion in newly rediscovered classics of Wittgenstein, Vygotsky, or just Wolf. So, well, I guess that so far the carried out discourse has been substantially free from confusion or doubt. However, at this point, a question arises. Just I put myself a question, namely, where does the interconnection between language and culture take place? Since we can take for granted that expressiveness is the result of the working of human mind, therefore expressiveness must take place just in the human mind. That is, in the mind of the individual who is involved in the process of communication, regardless of its form, spoken or written. Furthermore, we may ask one more question concerning the communicative repertoire put into service during a discourse by the language user. It appears that grammar, as you remember from the earlier stage of my presentation, is not sufficient to initiate discourse. Although, from the initial part of the presentation, we know that grammar is used to combine words, to form sentences, and finally enables the language user to be expressive. However, the question would be rather directed at the substance, which makes the triangle work and thus initiate communication. Hence, we would ask as follows. Another question or questions. What activates the triangle, or what makes expressiveness evident? What is responsible just for expressiveness? The answer seems to be simple, but we would never think about the core issue and correct answer unless we ask such questions. So this is just a philosophical approach. You don't have any answer if you don't ask a question. Can't be simpler, right? Hence, the insight of the communication triangle already created by us and by the language user and stored in his mind is filled with lexicon. Simple, but, well, anyway, we have just to pay attention to what actually it is. So, lexicon, this is the knowledge of words. Hence, the use of lexicon makes expressiveness evident. An appropriate use of words activates the triangle and makes the language user expressive due to his ability to combine linguistic competence with cultural competence. Depending on the user's lexical repertoire, his creativity and expressiveness may reach either a high or low level of communication. Here again, we come across one more evidence of language and culture interconnection, since there must be a source for a list of words making up a lexicon. What is the source? And the answer can be found in another quote. So, quote, "This is just the language user's culture, which is a supply of names and notions, producing a lexicon. All these names and notions are the product of thoughts, and all of them are neatly ordered in accordance with the rules responsible for logical expressiveness in the language, being an instrument used within a given community for the purpose of communication." End of quote. In any discussion over expressiveness and its lexical source, it must be remembered that lexicon may appear in two forms, universal and individual. A universal lexicon in a sort of dictionary of the widest possible scope of linguistic applicability, while an individual lexicon is a repertory of names and notions stored in the language user's mind. Therefore, the universal form is homogeneous, while the individual one is heterogeneous, which means that every single member of a social community, distinguished by its social cultural principles, possesses, as thus may demonstrate during communication, different names and notions, depending on what he stores in his individual repertoire. So, it is evident that the contents of the lexical repertoire testifies to the level of the individual's creativity and expressiveness, and thus it simultaneously provides evidence for the quality of his or her development and the level of language and culture. This is so because we have to remember that the language user's culture is responsible for producing a lexicon. This point of view finds support in Eleanor Ox, who says, in the earlier part of the present discussion, I did quote, and let me remind you, she said that meaning is embedded in cultural conceptions. Therefore, if we consider two languages as immanent parts of two cultures, we have to take into account that meaning and distinctions encoded in one language only are unique to that language alone. This is the essence of linguistic relativity, once presented by Benjamin Lee Whorf as hypothesis, which nowadays is being rediscovered. This is a different approach to the hypothesis often criticized. Rediscovered especially if it comes to deal with some problems in translatability. So, moreover, linguistic relativity, marked with its idea of completely arbitrary compartments full of culturally determined meanings, gives a strong support to the status of language and culture interconnection. So now let me conclude just briefly. By all accounts, language elegance and expressiveness par excellence are the proofs of interconnectedness between language and culture. Furthermore, interconnection between language and culture, or even interdependence, makes us aware of a serious educational problem which teachers of foreign languages may face in their teaching practice. From the above presented discussion comes out that teaching a language is simultaneous with the teaching of the culture associated with this language. Well, we have already learned, just to remind you my previous quote, that human culture always includes language, and human language cannot be thought without culture. Therefore, the teaching learning process aimed at philology students who are close to me, especially foreign language students, should be focused on developing in them a sort of creative communicative competence, being a vivid illustration of how language and culture work together. And actually, it was the title of the blog I've been discussing. Not only students of philology, but also language users in general, such as for example, journalists, translators, politicians, have to be sensitive to interdependence and interconnection between language and culture, because the wrong selection of lexical items from their repertoire will result in an inability to understand them, or in their misunderstanding, which is even more dangerous. Even a more serious problem is language offensiveness. Deficits in cultural competence may cause that your neatly constructed utterances are grammatically correct, but your language output is offensive from the point of view of culture. So you may not be aware of that. Grammar, perfect. Effect, the result, horrible. So it is believed that the aim of the present discussion has been attained, and our attention directed at language and culture interconnectedness, perceived as a separate area to be dealt with in the teaching learning process designed for philologists. So instead of criticism, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis has been viewed and revised here from a different perspective in order to make us sensitive to the effect that is the output of the language-culture interconnection and interrelatedness. So thank you very much for your patience and attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, actually, I have no words, Tomasz. I'm so much impressed, and the lecture was so thought-provoking that I have millions of questions. I will probably keep them for the future. And the floor is given to, well, actually, thank you very much. That was a kind of profound lecture with very many questions to go on thinking with.
Not only once, we have time to discuss not only these things, but some others. So,
of course, anyway. We have time. Let me invite our conference participants to ask you some questions in case they have some. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Anna, any questions?
Yes, there is one question that we often discuss with Irina Pavlovna, and it is closely related to the idea of culture and language, and maybe some of our future topics for research. We have read some reports that after Brexit, English still has much support in the European Union. And many people for whom English is not native believe that now, after England has left the Union, they feel more confident to speak the language, and they believe that the new variant of English exists, Euro-English. Mm-hmm. And some of the European EU institutions like this idea because it supports the vision of the pan-European identity, EU identity, super-national identity. How do you think, is it something real? I mean, Euro-English and pan-European culture, is it like, do we have enough elements of this culture to call it a culture? Or it is just an illusion, or I don't know, a result of shared economy, shared, I don't know, political structures, or already a new type of pan-European cultures that was discussed after the Second World War and so on. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Well, it's a very interesting issue. Well, as you said, research could be a really vast research, but just coming to the point, we may say like this: the issue you raised, well, can split into two. The point of view represented by us, philologists, and we are somehow obsessed with perfection, and we try somehow to combine these two sorts of competence and implant them in our students, linguistic competence plus cultural competence. And the other one, you mentioned Euro-English. Well, in Europe is not that bad, I would say. Generally speaking, the English version used among not only students but language users is more or less unified. Now, for example, if you talk to someone, if you talk to a Brit, you use your English and you make mistakes, you are never corrected because, well, it's quite natural. Now, sometimes, but occasionally it does happen that you are corrected, but never ever does it happen in America. And whatever you say is correct. See? The vast variety in America, really a vast variety of English. I'm not talking about dialects, which I teach with my students. We're talking about some dialects, American dialects, British English and some varieties, English varieties as spoken in Europe, Ireland, Scotland, England, or whatever. Anyway, this is the case. Look, we have to decide whether we view the problem from our point of view, perfectionists, obsessed, as I said, with the ability of joining the two sorts of competence, linguistic and cultural, and that's why, you know, the cultural competence matters. In a minute, I'll give you an example. How we know a deficit at a very low level, at let's say the level of beginners, can be somehow frustrating. But in a minute, just let me finish the point of view. So this is one. Well, we have to decide whether we would somehow concentrate on offering and demanding from our students to use, let's say, correct English, right? Or we would demand them to be communicative. That's the way to somehow acknowledge that they can communicate. Even, you know, with gestures.
Yeah, with this, yeah.
Yeah, even with gestures, they can communicate. But now, since I mentioned an example, look, now in the afternoon, I was just examining my students. They were coming into the room one by one in the afternoon. And I hear a knock, come in, and the student says, what? Good morning. See? Perfect? Perfect. Yes, but not, well, linguistically perfect, culturally wrong. And again, offensiveness. Well, of course, when I teach, you know, language varieties, when I concentrate on language varieties, especially British and English variety, well, I'll talk about some, let's say, obscene terminology or words. Now, well, in Europe, in British English, we were trousers, right? And that's fine, you do trousers. But in American English, well, of course they understand trousers, but, well, the word used is pants, which is underwear in British. So you have to be very careful whether you are talking to a Brit or to an American, right? Like this. So again, this is again a sort of cultural competence. Because, well, linguistically, both pants and trousers are correct. But culturally, well, it depends on the who you are talking to, Brit or American. So if I manage to answer your question, so fine. If I forgot about anything.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Interesting how diverse English is and how many opportunities it gives for researchers, both linguistically and culturally.
Right. True. Absolutely true.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have one more question. May I ask it? You know, Tomasz, I was sitting and thinking during your lecture, I was sitting and thinking about really redefining superior verb hypothesis. And it has just occurred to me that we can possibly put the hypothesis, the redefined hypothesis like this: cultural determinism or cultural relativity, not linguistic relativity, but cultural relativity. We can do it.
Absolutely, I agree. Yeah,
exactly. And you know, I was sitting and listening to you, and I was writing down some words in Polish. The words like buleczka, stokrotka, salatka, śmietanka, biedronka, galaretka. These are the words that I usually come across while shopping, for example, in Poland. And every time I read them, I think, what a beautiful language. What a beautiful nation speaking this language.
Diminutives.
Yes, can you feel this beauty of the Polish language in those suffixes, minimizing suffixes, diminishing suffixes? Because for us, the speakers of Ukrainian, this is a very culturally determined and culturally relative thing. Do you feel this beauty of the Polish language, or you are just doing this mechanically?
Well, I guess that's, you know, again, that's culture, and I would say not culture, but nature, just to use diminutives. Diminutives in English often are used in the case of names, first names.
Right.
John, Johnny, Jack, right? Maggie, etc. Now, in Polish, of course, we use diminutives in the case of names, first names, but, well, there's, I would say, it's something natural. It's a natural, well, I would even say, use the word behavior. Is passed on any other objects, any other names, as well, those you mentioned, bułeczka or whatever.
In Ukrainian, we have bulka, we have mandarina, and in Polish, there is mandarinki. So every time I read mandarinki, my soul starts blooming, you know. That's a very special thing.
Well, true, you are absolutely right once you mentioned that the hypothesis now being rediscovered can be expanded by that the third leg, not well, the cultural, let's say, aspect. The cultural, absolutely, this is the nature. This is the nature. This is the mentality. And well, I didn't want to take time in the morning during the presentation of the professor from Spain, but actually the Western Europe doesn't understand certain our mentality, Slavic mentality. I wouldn't say Polish or Ukrainian, Slavic. One more example from the States. I was staying with one university, and I was invited by a neighboring university to give an open lecture. And well, the American tradition is that once you are invited, you are given a sort of a counterpart, someone who takes care of you. Well, and I was cared by a beautiful young lady, young professor of Slovak origin, Slovak American. Now, of course, you know, the meeting was in English. I gave the lecture in English, and officially we were talking in English. And after the lecture, we wanted to continue just in private, just a party or something like this with her students. So we were on the way from the university building to a students' faculty club, going through a park. While going through the park, she said, well, look, I don't have a chance to use my Slovak, so perhaps we'll talk I use the Slovak, and you will understand. Okay, so, and she started speaking Slovak. she was speaking in Slovak and I was answering in Polish. Now her students were marching behind us, just a few paces behind. Once they were talkative, and suddenly they remained speechless, silent. And one of them couldn't stand the silence, approached us and said, "Excuse me, professor, never ever did you tell us that you know Polish." And then I said, "Okay, my dear, she's speaking Slovak and I am speaking." "Oh yeah, we would never expect that these two languages are so close. Languages, cultures, or whatever. Well, so this is again, you know, closeness, linguistic closeness, cultural closeness, and which is not understood by the Western communities. Unfortunately, they somehow perceived us, well, either, you know, they speak one language, or perhaps they speak dialects. Perhaps this is one language with a variety of dialects. So, well, mentality is different. That's why, you know, there are some problems. Again, I am coming back to the opening lecture. Some problems with the European Union because, the guidance by Germany or France is really, this is just a horrible experience. Well, to what countries? The Visegrad bloc, Czech Republic, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary, which is somehow traditionally related to Poland, to our culture. We had many common, we shared kings in the past. That's why, you know, although we never ever spoke in Poland, Hungarian wasn't spoken, while in Hungary, well, Polish is quite popular, I would say. Anyway, just this is marginal. This is my marginal remark, pointing to what can be done in the area, in the sphere, as Irina mentioned, in the sphere of culture. There's research studies and somehow to expand the ideas hidden in the hypothesis. They are something, as I said, they are rediscovered. There are many publications nowadays, just publications based on the rediscovery of Wittgenstein, Vygotsky, and Wolf. Okay, so that's it. Too long.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Any more questions? If there are no more questions, so thank you very much once again, Tomasz, for the profound lecture. We all enjoyed it.
Sorry for the length, because as I said, well,
sorry. We didn't notice how time passed, really. Thank you. Thank you very much. We are proceeding with our reports, and let me invite Oksana Rogač with a report running under the title National Values and Beliefs in the Context of Intercultural Communication. Another related topic. Welcome, Oksana.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the pleasure of being invited and talking to great people whom I can see. Well, my topic is related with the topic that was touched by Professor Tomasz, because we cannot not communicate. And while communicating, we are representatives not just of a nation, but of a culture. I like the image of culture that is used in business, in different trainings, and all of you, I'm sure, know about the iceberg, this cultural iceberg. It's so vivid. And we see that above the waterline, only 30% of the things are visible. They are above the waterline. All other things are hidden. That's why when we communicate, or when I talk to foreigners, I have in my mind this statement or a sentence that is stuck in my mind. And again and again, I hear this thought. I know what I say, but I don't know what you hear. This is so important to remember, because in spite of the fact that we all speak English, we use Englishes, still there are things that are hidden beneath the waterline, and they build our culture. When you were discussing the question about the role of English and what will happen to this language after Brexit, well, I'm thinking about our national languages. And when we consider, for example, in your case, the Polish language, in our case, the Ukrainian language, we will see that there are so many people who speak Ukrainian, and well, who speak standard Ukrainian? Maybe teachers of Ukrainian, maybe scholars, maybe researchers. When I communicate with the professors from the Department of the Ukrainian Philology, I'm not that confident, you know. I'm afraid that I've made a very serious mistake and they will make fun of me. So the question, what is a standard English? I think it's a rhetorical question and you don't have the answer, right? Though you're very right, the ability to communicate, that's the most important thing. And then as to my topic, values and beliefs, they are hidden beneath the waterline of this great cultural iceberg. And when we communicate, we are ruled by our values and our beliefs. We use English, for example, as a means of communication, but at the same time, we are representatives of different values and beliefs. A friend of mine who owns two big restaurants in the United States, they belong to the chain that is called Chick-fil-A. When he was getting married, he asked his future wife to sit down and make a list of values. And they made their list of values, and they wanted to see how compatible they were. Now they're happily married, and they have so much in common. When he hires people to work for him, every time he discusses his values with his employees, it's pretty unusual, though such things happen. Well, values are defined by different scholars in different ways. And for example, a well-known scholar whose name is Alexeyeva, she defines values as commonly held standards of what is acceptable or unacceptable, important or unimportant, right or wrong, then workable or unworkable in a community or a society. Of course, we distinguish different types of values like material and spiritual, utilitarian, socio-political, cognitive, moral values, aesthetic and religious, and this list could be continued. Also, researchers distinguish between such types of values as like personal values, corporate values, age values. This value is very important for me now as I am getting older, and when we are young, we don't think about the values of senior people. But with time, as you know, those who are my age, you know that our values are changing. We are changing, and our values are changing as well. Then values of large or small personal groups, historical values of different epochs and states, and universal values. And there are other groups of values, cultural values, such as like outstanding intellectual, artistic, and religious works. Then cultural values that consist of principles of coexistence. And I really like this word in the context of intercultural communication, because our values, they help us, or at least they must help us to coexist. And here we have to remember about our customs, stereotypes of consciousness and behavior, and they make a society integrated. Then there are different spheres where we apply cultural values, such as like everyday routine, ideology, religion, arts. And the sphere of everyday culture is the leading one, as it forms a personality and the processes of socialization and unculturalization that start in our childhood. Then the everyday culture contains eternal values, both universal and ethnic, that form ideology, religion, and arts. There are certain functions that these values perform in our life. Scholars believe that values give order to the world. They imbue the world with evaluative coloring. They give sense to human life. They correspond to ideas of the ideal, the desired, the normative. They regulate human activity as they control the choice of information in the interaction with the environment. Of course, they control social relations. They must control social relations, and they form feelings and communicative skills. There are certain systems of values, and scholars distinguish three types of values: universal, cultural, and individual. And that's the classification that I really like, because I do understand them. I believe that if we talk, for example, about universal values, we can give as an example the value of love. Some people may deny, but in most cases, people do want to be loved. And it's so important to love and to be loved. Then, of course, there are cultural values. And if we talk about our culture, there are many, many values. There are many things that are important to Ukrainians. But if we talk, for example, the value of bread in our culture, if we recollect our history and those horrible times of starvation and Holodomor and other horrible things that happened to our nation, we understand that the value of bread is of vital importance. And like when a baby is born, we come to see that newly born baby with a piece of bread. It can be a cake, or it can be just like a roll of bread. When a person is getting married, so what do we have? We have a wedding cake, or in our culture, korovai, right? We greet people with salt and bread every time when we welcome them into our homes and into our country. And the last appearance of us on this earth, when a person dies, we put a loaf of bread on the coffin lid. So this bread is extremely important. It is a sample of a very important value in our life. We never ever, I'm talking about, of course, ordinary Ukrainians, because there are exceptions, unfortunately, but usually we will never throw a piece of bread and we won't waste bread. Then, for example, the value of time. This value is rather questionable. And when we communicate with foreigners, many of them are rather skeptical. And for example, one of our American colleagues who has been working in Ukraine for years, he says that Ukrainians do not appreciate time. And it's not that we are that, time senseless. No, we appreciate time. It's just a part of our culture. And timing is so vital for many other European cultures, but at the same time, if we are late, well, that's not the matter of life or death. Yeah, so we don't mind staying longer if we are late, right? Though I know that it's something that in our culture we have to deal with, and we have to teach our students and ourselves to be on time, right? And then, of course, individual values. Everybody has his or her individual values, a list of values that are important. Then, every culture forms a system of values that is usually a hierarchy in which values are ordered according to their importance. And values are subjective as individuals. On the basis of their norms and customs, form a system of main values that guide them through their lives. Then values are connected with behavior because they shape our behavior. They're hidden under the waterline, but still they shape our behavior. And we know that culture consists of concepts, values, and assumptions about life, and they guide our behavior, both physical behavior and linguistic behavior. Some, as you know, some people say you are what you eat, but I can say that we are what we say, right? I'm not the author of this expression, I'm just quoting. These values are transmitted generation to generation, rarely with explicit instructions and by parents and the elders. And to understand where behavior comes from, to understand why people behave the way they do, means learning about values and beliefs, again, that are hidden beneath the waterline. The reason any behavior makes sense is because it is consistent with what a person believes in or holds dear. I think that when we communicate on the international levels, pretty often we take our samples and we apply those samples. We take our systems of values and we apply that system of values to other cultures, and they won't work. And I can compare that with, for example, American descriptivism, and the founders of this school, like Boas, when they were studying the languages of Native Americans, at that time Indians, right? They tried to apply the matrix of the Latin language, and it did not work because those people belonged to different cultures, and they had their own system of value, like the value of time. They don't have the system of tenses because that's not important. I mean, the time is not important for many Native Americans. It's the harmony with nature that matters, right? Okay, that's how much I know about that. I don't speak those languages, unfortunately. We can mention here, for example, the connection between the behavior and the value. For example, if we talk about such things as, for example, directness, and well, if we appreciate, if we value directness, then we will speak our mind. In our culture, and again, I'm generalizing because culture is about generalization in most cases, right? And very often, Ukrainians hesitate to say openly what they think. They try to find some ways how to describe that. They'd rather talk to a friend of that person with whom they want to, they should have the direct conversation and so on. Then, for example, the value of family. Well, what is more important? Work, family, career. Well, these things are, they also belong to a system of value. Or for example, fatalism. Many Ukrainians believe that what is written in your life book is to happen. That's the value they are ruled by. I'm not again saying that everybody believes that. Respect for age. In some cultures, as you know, there are senior people who are respected, and they are the authority in the country, not just in the culture. Well, in many cultures, we know that, well, if you're a senior or old, it doesn't mean that you know more than I do, unfortunately. Then informality. Well, again, it's the thing that is common in, for example, in American culture, and even the disappearance of the distinction between you and thee, right? So this is a very informal thing. I still feel kind of uncomfortable when my son-in-law, who is Australian, calls me Oksana. I don't know, it's okay, but at the beginning, I was kind of uncomfortable. Yeah, there was nothing wrong with that, but still, you know, this is something I'm not accustomed to. I wasn't accustomed to. Then self-reliance. In many cultures, people know that they can rely only on themselves, not on other people or state, and so on. Here I have a list of 13 American cultural values that are important in their culture. And I'm using this list just to compare what they respect in comparison with our cultures. For example, attitude towards age. Well, actually, Americans don't care much, and they say that new is always better. And when I talk, for example, with English teachers, and I ask them about the changes, most of them are reluctant to changes because it's a part of our nature, it's a part of our culture to be reluctant to changes. While in American culture, wow, that's great. And to me, well, a change is good if it is far away. If it is very close, well, I don't know what to expect. Then concept of fate and destiny. Americans negate much influence of fate and destiny. They have to be in control. They plan everything in advance, well in advance. Yeah. Then view of human nature. People are considered basically and inherently good. Well, yeah, it's a very positive attitude, but again, it's a generalization, as the recent events, unfortunately, in the United States, they have proved the opposite. Then again, attitude towards change, new is better. Then attitude towards taking risks. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Well, we can recollect the Russian proverb, yeah, the one who doesn't take risks won't drink champagne. Well, it's a great expression, but at the same time, well, in many cultures, people are risk adverse. And in our communication, we can explain like why people do this or that if we know their values or their list of values, what they are ruled by. Then a concept of suffering or a misfortune. Americans believe that people are in control of their lives. And I heard that from ordinary Americans, like our colleague, Douglas O'Brien, he always says, well, I want to be in charge. He uses the word, I want to be in charge. Well, yeah, I'm rather skeptical as to this, but that's his attitude to life. Then the concept of face. They believe that it's important to be straight with people. I don't know, maybe it's good to be that straight, but I try to be diplomatic rather than straight. Then source of self-esteem or self-worth. Material possessions are a measure of success, unfortunately. And yeah, I think that nowadays we converted into a society of consumers, unfortunately. And we don't see those things that are hidden again beneath the waterline. Those cheap goods or like goods that are sold to us, they won't last for a long time. They, in such a way, business makes us buy more and more, right? Then attitude towards formality. Informality is necessary in a mobile society. Americans move a lot. That's why informality is important to them. And Americans are informal in social and professional, in most cases, in professional interactions. Then degree of realism. And they say that an individual is in control, and they believe that things will get better. Then attitude towards doing. So they believe that doing is preferred over talking. And even they have this great book that has the title, To Walk the Talk. And the last, that's the 13th value, view of the natural world. So they believe that the natural world is a kind of machine or a mechanism that can be studied and known, and whose workings can be predicted, manipulated, and controlled. We see the results of such attitude, or it's a part of the list of their values. And when we interfere into nature, we see what we can have, like our horrible catastrophe in Chernobyl. That's a very vivid example, sad and vivid example. There are some sources of American culture, and they say that it's Protestantism, like a strong work ethic, then American geography, distance from Europe, isolation, rich natural resources, then the escape from repression, and the nature of the American immigrant. That's little fear of failure. Wow. And I have the last slide that is connected with the British values and attitudes, and we can see the difference. It's shorter, but still we can see the differences. And I really like the series of books that has the title Xenophobes Guide. And then they suggest the nation, for example, a Xenophobe's Guide to the Americans, or to the British, to the Russians, and to the Welsh, and so to the French. And it was interesting that the books were to be written by foreigners who had to spend in a country at least 5 years in order to understand the culture, a system of values, and things that are not noticed by native people. Like, there are so many things in Lutsk that I don't pay attention to because I've been living here since I was born. But when I go to another city, I do pay attention to other things that are very known to the local people. And in one of those books devoted to the English, these values were mentioned. And here we have common sense. So in England, it is central to the English attitude to almost everything in life. Common sense. There must be common sense in everything. Then class. English tradition demands the existence of 3 classes. Aristocracy is like 1%, merchants, middle class, and workers. Then conversation. Well, here we have to talk about accents, English words rather than foreign, and directness. A friend of mine who made a very, very successful career in the British Secret Service, he was born in one of the villages. He was born in the country of England. And of course, he spoke with an accent. And his mom told him if he wanted to make a career, he had to get rid of his local accent. Yeah, and okay, I could comment more, but I don't want to steal the time. Then when we talk about another value, that is table manners, they are respected. Then wealth and success, old money versus new money. And well, again, it is hidden beneath the waterline, but people who are representatives of old money, of course, to some extent, they will be arrogant to the representatives of the new money. And if there are faux pas in communication, those things can be explained by the values that are hidden. Then dress. Casual clothes chosen for their comfort and warmth, not appearance. Yeah, we do hear a lot of comments when we communicate with people from other cultures. When they're in Ukraine, they say that, well, your women are not just women, they are super women because they're well dressed, they wear high heels, they carry heavy bags, they look after their kids, and so on and so forth. So our women are considered to be like super women. They have to do so much. Then, for example, it's a part of nonverbal communication because with the way in which we dress ourselves shows our attitude to this or that culture. And I'm using here the example that is taken again from Ukrainians. I was going back from Australia to Ukraine, and I was in Dubai, and I could find the right gate due to the fact that those of you, and I'm sure that you have been to Dubai, to this huge airport where you can easily be lost. And I was able to find the gate due to the fact that I looked at the people who were standing at that gate. And one lady, she was in this Muslim country. She was wearing very short shorts, a blouse with a very low cut, and well, and there were some other things. And I was thinking about her behavior and her attitude toward the local culture. That was just like, to put it mildly, a disrespect. Again, so she had her own values, but at the same time, she didn't care about the values of the country where she was. And I think that it was rather offensive. Well, and the last thing that I would like to mention, that's the value of love. And according to the author of the book, Xenophob's Guide, romanticism is a threat to practicality and common sense. So it's kind of unusual, but well, maybe to some extent it is right, because in the English language we have this expression, to fall in love. It's like to fall ill. So I think that it's a part of our life that can influence our behavior greatly. And in order to conclude, I would like to say that when we communicate with the representatives of other cultures, at least it's very, very vital to read a tiny booklet about the values, or read on the internet about the main values of those people. Otherwise we can be in trouble, because no matter how well we might know the language, there are so many things that are hidden beneath the waterline and we don't see them, and they can ruin our communication, and well, instead of understanding, it can cause misunderstanding and fights or conflicts like we have in the East. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Oksana. Thank you. We couldn't but admire your, again, mini lecture with a lot of good examples. Now, ladies and gentlemen, any questions?
Oh, yes.
Welcome.
Okay.
Just so many interesting things were raised in your presentation, Oksana. Really, it's difficult to concentrate on one question only. So you would rather ask a bunch of questions. Anyway, just one thing. Not so much a question. I will put a question later on. But look, you somehow also made a reference to what I was talking about, especially the hypothesis. Since you mentioned the studies on Indian languages. It's both Franz Boas and Kenneth Pike, who examined the languages of American Indians, just came to the point that certain, let's say, expressions cannot be translated because this is the human nature, the local people nature, and this is how they express, not say, but express themselves. And again, you mentioned, I did mention offensiveness, and you gave an example of offensiveness at the airport, for example. This is, well, you have to know how to behave, right? How to, even your appearance, your outlook, so just should be adjusted to the environment, right? This is a very important thing. Now, the question is, well, culture, values, how to teach such things, right? Well, as you said, well, there is a proverb that actions speak better than words. And now, so not everyone can demonstrate how to behave properly. Even, a teacher may not know what is proper, what is not, right? So actually you can't expect from a teacher that he or she would somehow explain the students how to behave properly, how to use language properly, even so. Anyway, now the question is, have you ever thought about a sort of, let's say, well, a handbook or just teaching material, somehow to offer such knowledge, to share such knowledge with the students, just to make them competent. And then, and again, I would use the term I did use, competence, complete competence. Which one is complete? Linguistic, not enough. Cultural, not enough. Cultural, linguistic, it makes sense, and it is a point of departure, let's say. But well, even cultural competence, well, it's so vast, it's so, you know, the notion is so vast that, well, teaching, you know, cultural competence is really an extremely demanding task. And I wonder, you know, have you ever thought, just repeating my, have you ever thought about a teaching material somehow to offer this sort of knowledge to the audience, to students?
Oh yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, I do believe that a good part of the education of an English teacher, or of a translator, or of interpreter, or a philologist in general, is connected with culture. That's why, having taken the syllabus from Poland, where you do have culture as a part of your curriculum, we introduced this subject into our curriculum as well, and I'm really very happy that we did that. And we have a course, for example, business communication, and we have that was conducted. It's my experience, and you're very right that it's necessary to have a good handbook, do's and don'ts, and it's necessary to combine that with the language as well, because language reflects what was happening in the history of this or that culture. The same with cultural artifacts. And it's very important, for example, if it is possible to find a native speaker who could teach such a course, because he or she will know the language items, and he will know the reasons, like why this or that thing was called with this or that name. Yeah, so a handbook is a great idea, and I use when I teach intercultural communication, I use the book prepared and published by Cambridge University Press. That's Derek Utley. And in his book, he gives different assignments and case studies, and they do help to understand why things are the way they are and why they are named the way they are named.
Well, thank you. Just one more remark. Since you mentioned your son-in-law calling you for your first name, well, I must tell you that, well, in a sense, I'm the only person, perhaps, in the department, here and at some other places, who refers to the students by their first names. And this is a sort of lesson I teach them. This is, you know, smuggling, let's say, smuggling some cultural information that, well, in this particular, since you study English, or since you're a student of American studies, so you have to have somehow, you have to know how to function within this particular culture, whose language you use, and presumably you may represent the culture as well. That's why I don't remember that I ever I could use any name, not the first name, while making reference to students. Never ever did I say Mr. or Miss or whatever, just, you know, gradually they get used to that. And again, you know, I had my American students in the States and in Poland, because I was running a Polish-American program at Marie Curie University when I was teaching there. Now, they came to Poland and they knew, they were prepared. They were given those orientations. They attended those orientation programs.
Yeah.
So how to behave all that. So they knew that, well, they have just to be respectful, etc., etc. So the first question they asked me was, well,